The Wilson mansion stood like a silent giant on top of a golden hill. Its glass windows sparkled in the sunlight, and its tall iron gates guarded it like soldiers. To strangers it looked like a dream, the home of one of the richest men in the country. But for the boy living inside, it was nothing more than a beautiful cage. His name was Ethan Wilson. 10 years old, small for his age, with eyes that carried too many storms. He was the son of Richard Wilson, a billionaire businessman known for his cold voice and endless work. The world called Richard successful. Magazines called him the king of steel and gold. But Ethan only knew him as the man who was never home. The mansion had everything: marble floors, chandeliers, pools, servants, and gardens that stretched for acres. But it lacked one thing: love. No laughter, no warmth, no one to tuck a child into bed at night. The air felt heavy, like the house itself was tired of pretending to be perfect. Ethan's mother, Clara Wilson, had died when he was only 5.
She had been the light in the mansion, gentle, kind, and always humming soft lullabies.
When she passed away, the light went out with her. Richard buried himself in business deals, meetings, and numbers. He believed money could fix everything, but some things cannot be repaired with gold. Ethan grew up surrounded by silence and strangers. His father hired nannies, dozens of them. Some came with big smiles, some with expensive perfumes, some with fake kindness. But none stayed for long. Ethan hated them all. He wasn't cruel by nature, just broken in ways he didn't understand. He threw tantrums, broke toys, shouted, and refused to listen. He wanted attention, not care. He wanted love, not rules. Each time a nanny left crying, he felt a strange victory. But deep down, he also felt emptier. By the time he turned 10, the staff whispered about him behind closed doors. "That boy's impossible," they said. "No one can handle him." The mansion's halls carried those whispers like ghosts, and Ethan heard them all. Sometimes he would sit by his window watching the world outside. The children at the park running, laughing, falling, getting up again. They had what he longed for. He wanted someone to hold his hand when he was scared. Someone to listen to his stories even if they didn't make sense. Someone to call family. But all he had was silence. And silence can be cruel when it's all you hear. One cold evening, as rain painted the glass, Ethan sat in his mother's old room. He touched her photo gently, tracing her smile with his little fingers. "Why did you go?" he whispered. "Everyone goes." His words disappeared into the shadows. Downstairs, Richard Wilson sat in his office signing papers without reading them. His empire grew every day, but his home was falling apart. He didn't notice how pale his son looked, how lonely his eyes had become. He only noticed numbers and profit, loss, deals, deadlines. He had forgotten how to see hearts. The housekeeper, Mrs. Lane, tried to talk to him once. "Sir, the boy needs someone. Someone who cares," she said softly. Richard didn't even look up. "Hire another nanny," Mrs. Lane sighed. She had heard those words too many times. But she did as she was told. And so, one morning, another car arrived at the mansion gates. Another woman stepped out, holding an old brown bag and a quiet look in her eyes. She was not like the others. No fancy clothes, no high heels, no perfume cloud. Just calm strength and a gentle presence. Her name was Grace Mbatha. Ethan watched from his window as she entered the house. To him, she was just another stranger who would leave soon, another face pretending to care. He didn't know that this woman, with her simple smile and kind eyes, was about to change everything. For the first time in years, the cold mansion was about to feel alive again. The next morning began quietly. The sun was still hiding behind gray clouds and the air smelled of rain. The mansion, as always, was silent, except for the soft footsteps of servants trying not to disturb the little prince of the house. At exactly 9 o'clock, the main door opened and Grace Mbatha stepped inside. She was a woman in her early 40s, tall and calm with warm brown eyes and a face that carried both kindness and strength. Her clothes were simple, her shoes a little worn, and in her hand was a small leather bag. She didn't look like anyone who had worked in that house before. Mrs. Lane, the housekeeper, greeted her politely. "Good morning, Miss Mbatha. You must be the new maid." Grace smiled gently. "Just Grace will do." Mrs. Lane studied her for a moment. There was something about her. Something peaceful, something real. "Well, I wish you luck," Mrs. Lane whispered. "The boy, he's not easy," Grace nodded. "No child becomes hard without reason." Those words made Mrs. Lane pause. She had never heard anyone say it quite like that. Grace began her first morning quietly. She cleaned the dusty corners that other maids ignored. She hummed as she worked, soft tunes from her village in South Africa, songs her mother used to sing while cooking or washing clothes by the river. The melody floated through the long, empty halls, wrapping around the house like a soft blanket. Upstairs, Ethan sat on the floor of his room, building and then destroying a tower of toy blocks. The music reached his ears. It wasn't a song he knew, but it made something inside him stop. It was gentle. Human. He frowned and looked toward the door. Who's making that noise? A few minutes later, Grace appeared at his door. She smiled kindly. "Good morning, young sir." Ethan didn't even turn to look at her. "I'm not your sir," he muttered. "And I don't need another nanny. You can go." Grace didn't move. "I'm not your nanny," she said softly. "I'm the maid. I clean floors and make food. You don't have to talk to me if you don't want to." That answer confused him. Everyone before her had tried too hard. Too many smiles, too many fake sweet voices. But this woman sounded calm, almost peaceful. "Then why are you in my room?" he asked sharply. She looked around the messy floor. "Because your room is part of the house," she replied. "And the house needs care just like people do." Ethan rolled his eyes. "You talk strange." Grace chuckled lightly. "Maybe, but I mean what I say." She knelt down and began picking up his broken toys. Ethan waited for her to scold him or tell him to clean up himself. But she didn't. She just worked quietly, humming again. "Why are you humming?" he asked finally, his curiosity breaking through his anger. "Because it makes work feel lighter," she said, "and sometimes it makes the walls less lonely." "The walls aren't lonely," he said. Grace looked at him gently. "Aren't they?" Ethan didn't answer. He just watched her for a moment as she carefully placed his toys on the shelf. Something about her movements felt kind. Not forced, not fake, just kind. When she stood to leave, he blurted out, "Everyone leaves. You'll leave too." Grace turned to him with a small smile. "Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. But until I do, I'll keep things clean." She walked out of the room, her soft song following her down the hallway. Ethan sat there staring at the door long after she was gone. For the first time, he didn't feel angry. He felt something else. Something warm and strange. That evening, as the rain began to fall outside, Ethan heard the same humming again. It came from the kitchen mixed with the smell of fresh bread. He crept down the stairs quietly, barefoot, curious. Grace was there, singing as she worked, her hands moving gracefully over the dough. He stood at the doorway and listened. He didn't say a word and she didn't notice him. But for the first time in years, the sound of laughter, soft and real, escaped from his lips. And though he didn't know it yet, that single sound was the first crack in the walls he had built around his heart. Days passed quietly after Grace Mbatha entered the Wilson mansion. She didn't force her presence into anyone's life. She simply worked, steady, humble, and peaceful. But her quietness had a strange power. Slowly, it began to fill the cold mansion with something new, something alive. Ethan noticed it first in small ways. The house didn't feel as silent anymore. There was always a soft hum of music, or the gentle sound of a broom brushing the marble floors. Sometimes he could even smell something warm, fresh bread, roasted chicken, or cinnamon tea. It was different from the usual fancy meals served by chefs. It smelled like home. At first, Ethan pretended not to care. He stayed in his room, watching from his window as Grace worked in the garden. She didn't order other servants around. She did things with her own hands. Sometimes she sang, sometimes she spoke softly to the flowers. He thought it was strange at first, but also a little magical. One afternoon, curiosity got the better of him. He walked to the garden and stood behind her. "Why do you talk to flowers?" he asked. Grace didn't turn around. She smiled while watering the plants. "Because they listen better than people," she said lightly. That answer made Ethan laugh, really laugh. The sound surprised both of them. Grace turned to see his face, glowing with the kind of joy that had been missing for too long. "Ah," she said with a grin, "so the young master can laugh." "I'm not your young master," Ethan said quickly, still smiling. "Then what should I call you?" she asked. "Ethan," he said softly. "Just Ethan," Grace nodded. "All right then, just Ethan." From that day something changed. Ethan started visiting her more often. He would sit near the kitchen door as she cooked, pretending to read or play with a toy while secretly watching her work. Grace didn't mind. She never asked questions that hurt. She never tried to fix him. She just let him be. Sometimes she told him stories. About her village in South Africa. About how people helped each other even when they had nothing. "We didn't have gold or cars," she said, "but we had hearts that cared." Ethan listened silently. Those stories painted pictures in his mind. Sunlit fields, children laughing, people singing together under open skies. It was so different from the lonely life he knew. He asked one evening, "Do you miss it?" Grace looked out the window, her eyes soft. "Every day," she said, "but I believe we carry home inside us. Wherever there is kindness, there is home." Ethan didn't understand completely, but he liked how it sounded. The other servants began to notice the difference too. The boy who used to shout and break things was now calmer. He smiled sometimes. He even said thank you. The mansion felt warmer, brighter. It was as if Grace had opened windows that had been shut for years. One day, Ethan decided to surprise her. He tried to help her in the kitchen, cutting vegetables clumsily. Grace laughed when she saw the mess. "Careful, little one. You'll lose a finger," he giggled. "Then you'll have to bandage it." Grace looked at him with mock seriousness. "Then I'll charge you for the bandage." Their laughter filled the room. It echoed through the marble halls, reaching even the closed doors of Richard Wilson's office upstairs. He paused for a moment, frowning. It had been years since he'd heard that sound, his son laughing. But instead of joy, something bitter twisted in his heart. Who was this woman who could make his son laugh when he could not? That evening, Richard saw Ethan sitting at the dining table with Grace, helping her arrange the dishes. He felt an emotion he couldn't name. Jealousy mixed with guilt. He didn't interrupt them, but his silence grew heavier. Meanwhile, Ethan and Grace shared a smile over a bowl of soup. "You know," Ethan said shyly, "I don't hate you like I hated the others." Grace smiled softly. "That's because I don't try to change you, Ethan, I just see you." He looked up, his heart full for the first time in years. No one had ever said that to him before, and in that quiet moment, the invisible walls around his heart began to crack, not with pain but with hope. Weeks turned into months, and life inside the Wilson mansion began to change in quiet, beautiful ways. The rooms that once echoed with emptiness were now filled with small sounds of life, the clinking of cups, soft laughter, gentle songs. The flowers outside started blooming again, and even the servants smiled more. It was as if the house itself had started to breathe after years of silence. And at the heart of that change stood Grace Mbatha. She didn't act like a servant. She worked like one, yes, but her presence felt different. Human, warm, kind. She didn't talk much, yet when she did, her words stayed in people's hearts. She had a way of making everything feel simpler, lighter. For Ethan, she had become more than a maid. She was his friend, his listener, his safe place. He followed her around the house like a quiet shadow. In the kitchen, in the garden, even when she was folding laundry. He liked the sound of her voice and the way she smiled at him without pretending. One evening, after finishing his homework, Ethan went to the kitchen where Grace was making soup. He climbed onto the counter and asked, "Grace, did you ever have a son?" She looked at him surprised and then smiled sadly. "No, Ethan, I didn't, but if I had, I think I'd want him to be a lot like you." Ethan's eyes brightened. "Even though I'm not perfect?" Grace touched his cheek gently. "No one is perfect, my boy. But you have a heart that still wants to love, even after being hurt. That's more beautiful than perfection." The boy smiled, a real, honest smile that reached his eyes. But upstairs, Richard Wilson was watching. He stood silently near the staircase, half hidden in the shadows, listening to their laughter. A strange pain grew in his chest. He had built his empire, bought everything money could buy, and yet his own son was finding comfort in the arms of a stranger. That night, he called for Mrs. Lane. "Who is this Grace woman?" he asked sharply. Mrs. Lane hesitated. "She's the new maid, sir. But she's different. She cares for Ethan. The boy is happier now." Richard's jaw tightened. "She's a maid, not a therapist. I didn't hire her to interfere in my son's life." Mrs. Lane lowered her voice. "With respect, sir, maybe that's what the boy needs, someone who actually cares." Her words hit him like a slap. He dismissed her with a cold wave of his hand. But later that night, lying in his large empty bed, Richard couldn't sleep. He thought about his wife, how she used to sing to Ethan, how her laughter used to fill the house. He realized painfully that Grace's presence reminded him of Clara, gentle, kind, human. And it scared him. The next evening, Richard came home early for the first time in months. He walked into the kitchen and froze. Grace and Ethan were sitting together at the table, laughing over a mess of flour and dough. Grace had flour on her hands and Ethan had some on his nose. They both looked so happy, so alive. What is going on here? Richard's deep voice broke the moment like thunder. Ethan turned, startled. "We were just making bread, Dad." Richard's expression was cold. "This is not a playground. Grace, you are overstepping your role." Grace stood up slowly, her voice calm but firm. "Sir, I was only keeping the boy company." "He's lonely." "That's enough," Richard interrupted. "You're paid to clean, not to mother my son." Ethan's heart sank. "She's not my mother." "But she's nicer than you." The words burst out of him before he could stop them. Silence filled the kitchen. Grace looked down, pain flickering in her eyes. Richard stared at his son, speechless. Ethan ran out of the room, tears streaming down his face. Grace wanted to go after him, but Richard's hard voice stopped her. "You've done enough." That night, the mansion felt like it had fallen back into darkness. The music was gone, the laughter silenced. Grace sat alone in her small room, staring at her packed bag. She knew what always came next. People like her never stayed long in houses like this. Still, she whispered into the quiet air, "Maybe I couldn't stay forever, but at least I reminded that boy how to smile again." And upstairs, a small boy cried himself to sleep, clutching the wooden bird she had carved for him days ago, afraid that by morning, she'd be gone. The next morning came quietly, almost painfully. The sun tried to break through the heavy clouds, but even the light looked tired. Inside the Wilson mansion, the air felt different, heavy, cold, and silent again. The laughter that once warmed its walls was gone. Grace Mbata stood in her small room, folding her few belongings into her old brown bag. Her eyes were red, though she had not shed tears. She had learned long ago that some goodbyes didn't need tears. The pain in the heart was enough. She looked around the room one last time. It wasn't much: a narrow bed, a small table, and a vase with one white flower Ethan had picked for her a week ago. It was already wilting. As she touched the soft petals, a memory flashed in her mind. Ethan's laugh, his small hands covered in flour, his bright eyes shining with joy. For a few weeks she had seen him come alive, and now it was time to go. Downstairs, Richard Wilson sat in his office, pretending to read reports. But his mind wasn't on his work. He could hear faint movements from upstairs, the sound of a suitcase being closed, slow footsteps on the wooden floor. Each sound made his chest feel heavier. He knew Grace was leaving. He had told her himself. Yet something about it didn't feel right. The mansion was returning to its usual quiet, but instead of peace it felt empty. Then came the sound of small feet running down the hallway. Ethan burst into Grace's room, his face pale, eyes wide with panic. "You're leaving?" he cried. His voice broke like glass. "You can't leave, Grace. You promised you wouldn't go." Grace turned toward him, her heart twisting. She knelt and pulled him into her arms. "Oh, my sweet boy. I didn't promise forever. I only promised to stay as long as I could." Ethan clung to her tightly, his small body trembling. "I'll talk to Dad. I'll tell him to let you stay. Please don't go, Grace. Please." Grace closed her eyes. She wished she could tell him she would stay. But she couldn't. She wasn't leaving because she wanted to. She was leaving because this house and this world had its walls too high for people like her. She gently placed something in his hand, a small wooden bird carved beautifully, its wings spread wide. "This is from my home," she said softly. "It means freedom. Keep it with you. When you feel alone, hold it and remember. Hearts like yours were made to fly." Ethan stared at the little carving, tears dripping onto it. "But I don't want freedom. I want you," Grace smiled sadly. "One day you'll understand. Sometimes love means letting go, not holding on." He didn't understand those words. Not yet. He only knew that the person who made his world bright was walking away. As Grace stood to leave, Richard appeared in the doorway. His face was hard, but his eyes told another story. Guilt, sorrow, and something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. "Mr. Wilson," Grace said quietly. "Thank you for giving me work. Please take care of your son." He nodded stiffly. "I will." But Ethan shouted through his tears, "You won't. You never do. You don't even see me." Richard froze. The words hit him like thunder. Grace put a gentle hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Don't be angry, little one. Anger builds walls. You need to break them." And with that she turned and walked out. Ethan ran after her, but Mrs. Lane held him back gently. "Let her go, child," she whispered, her own eyes wet. "She's done what she came to do." Outside, the car engine started. Grace looked back once, just once, and saw Ethan standing at the window, holding the little bird against his heart. She smiled through her tears, whispering to herself, "Fly, little one. One day you'll understand." The car drove away, leaving behind only silence. Inside the mansion, Ethan sat by the window for hours, waiting for the sound of her song. But it never came. The house felt colder, darker. He pressed the wooden bird to his chest, whispering her name over and over. And in another room, Richard Wilson sat at his desk, staring at nothing. For the first time in his life, he felt what money could never fix: the emptiness of a heart without love. The mansion was silent once more. But this time the silence didn't feel peaceful, it felt hollow, painful, almost alive. Every corner of the house whispered her absence. The soft humming that used to float through the air was gone. The smell of warm bread and laughter no longer filled the kitchen. Grace Mbatha had left, and with her, she took the light that had begun to heal their hearts. Ethan woke up the next morning and waited for the familiar sound of her song. But there was only quiet. He ran downstairs calling her name. "Grace, Grace!" His small voice echoed through the empty halls. No one answered. He found Mrs. Lane in the kitchen, wiping her eyes with her apron. "She's gone, sweetheart," the old woman said gently. "She left early this morning." Ethan shook his head, refusing to believe it. "She said she'd stay. She said she wouldn't leave me." Mrs. Lane sighed, her voice trembling. "Sometimes people have to leave even when they don't want to." Ethan ran back to his room, slammed the door, and threw himself on the bed. He held the little wooden bird in his hand, the one Grace had given him. He pressed it to his chest and whispered, "Please come back. I'll be good this time. I promise, but the house stayed silent. Downstairs, Richard Wilson sat in his office. He tried to work, but the numbers on the paper blurred. He could still see the look on his son's face the night before, the tears, the pain, the anger. Ethan's words kept repeating in his head, "You don't even see me." Those words hurt more than any business loss he had ever suffered. Because they were true. He had spent years chasing success, believing that wealth could build happiness, but all it had built were walls. Thick, cold walls that had locked him away from the only family he had left. That evening, he passed by Ethan's room. The boy was sitting by the window, staring into the darkness, the small wooden bird in his lap. Richard stood at the door for a long moment, unsure how to begin. "Ethan," he said softly. The boy didn't turn around. "You made her leave." Richard swallowed. "I thought I was protecting you." Ethan's voice cracked. "From what?" "She was the only one who cared about me." The father had no answer. He stepped inside, the floor creaking under his shoes. "I didn't realize how much she meant to you." Ethan looked up, his eyes red and tired. "You don't realize anything about me." Richard's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. So he just sat beside his son awkwardly, quietly. It was the first time they had sat together in years. The silence between them felt strange, but not as empty as before. After a long pause, Richard said softly, "She left something behind." Ethan looked at him.
What? Richard held up a folded piece of paper.
"Mrs. Lane found this in her room. It's addressed to me." He opened it carefully. The handwriting was neat, gentle, just like Grace. "Sir, the boy doesn't need another nanny. He needs a father. He doesn't need gifts or luxury. He needs love, attention, and time. He is hurt but not broken. His heart still believes in goodness. Please don't let that light fade again." Grace Mbatha Richard's eyes filled with tears. It was the first time in years he had cried. He looked at his son and whispered, "She's right, Ethan. I failed you." Ethan didn't know what to say. He just hugged his wooden bird tighter. That night, Richard didn't go back to his office. He sat beside Ethan's bed until the boy finally fell asleep. For the first time, he noticed how small and fragile his son looked, how much like Clara, his late wife, he had become. When Ethan's hand slipped into his, Richard didn't pull away. He just sat there in the dim light, holding it tightly, silently promising himself that he would never let his son feel alone again. Outside, the rain began to fall softly against the windows, but for once the sound didn't feel sad. It felt cleansing, like the world was washing away old pain. Grace was gone, but her presence still lived inside that house, in every flower she planted, in every lesson she left behind. And in the quiet heart of the mansion, a father finally began to wake up. Days turned into weeks, and yet the mansion still felt dim. Richard Wilson tried to smile for his son, but there was a quiet ache inside him that never left. Grace's words from the letter echoed in his mind every day. He doesn't need gifts. He needs love. He started spending more time with Ethan. They played board games in the living room, took walks in the garden, and even baked cookies together, though most of them burned. The boy laughed again, slowly learning to trust. But every time someone mentioned Grace, a shadow crossed his eyes. He missed her deeply, silently. One cold morning, Ethan walked into his father's office carrying a photo. It was one of Grace, smiling beside the garden roses she had planted. "Dad," he said softly, "can we find her?" Richard looked at the picture for a long time. The woman who had once been just a maid had changed everything. She had given him back his son, his purpose, his heart. He nodded. "Yes, Ethan, we'll find her." They searched for days. Calls were made, old contacts were used, but no one knew where Grace had gone. Mrs. Lane finally remembered that Grace had spoken once about her hometown, a small village far from the city, where her mother still lived. So father and son packed a small bag and drove for hours, through winding roads, dusty fields, and quiet hills. Ethan's excitement mixed with fear. What if she didn't want to see them again? When they finally reached the village, the air smelled of earth and rain. Small houses stood close together. Children played barefoot in the streets and laughter echoed through the wind. It felt alive. The kind of life money could never buy. They asked around until a kind woman pointed them to a small blue house near the river. "That's Grace's mother's home," she said. Ethan ran ahead, his heart pounding. Richard followed slowly, nervous, unsure what he would say. Outside the house, Grace was kneeling by a garden, her hands covered in soil. When she looked up, her eyes widened. For a moment, she couldn't move. Then she saw Ethan, and then everything else disappeared. "Ethan?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The boy ran to her and threw his arms around her. "You left me," he cried. "You said you'd stay." Grace held him tightly, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't want to leave, my boy. I had to. Sometimes love means stepping away so others can find their way back." Ethan shook his head, clinging to her. "But I needed you." Grace smiled through her tears. "And look at you now. You're stronger, braver. You have your father again." Richard stood a few steps behind, guilt heavy in his chest. "Grace," he said quietly. She turned to face him. Her eyes were kind but guarded. "Mr. Wilson," he took a deep breath. "You were right. About everything. I was blind. I thought money could fix everything, but I was wrong. You showed me what really matters." Grace looked at him for a long moment, then nodded softly. "It's never too late to love your child, sir." Richard's voice cracked. "I know, and I want to thank you for saving my son. And for saving me." She smiled gently. "You saved yourself. I only reminded you how." Ethan looked up at his father. "Can she come home with us?" "Please?" Grace hesitated. Her eyes softened. "I have a life here, Ethan. But we're your family too," the boy whispered. Her heart trembled at his words. She glanced at Richard, and in his eyes she saw something new. Sincerity, humility, and warmth. He said quietly, "You'll always have a place with us, Grace. Not as a maid, as someone who belongs." For a moment she didn't answer. Then she knelt and brushed Ethan's hair gently. "All right, little one. But only if your father promises never to forget what love looks like." Richard smiled, a true smile, the first in years. "I promise." As they drove back home, the air felt lighter. Ethan held Grace's hand in one and his father's in the other. The mansion no longer felt like a cold palace waiting to be filled. It was a home again. Weeks later, laughter once again filled its halls. Flowers bloomed brighter in the garden. Richard often found himself standing by the window, watching Grace and Ethan plant new roses together. Every time he looked at them, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Peace. Grace had walked into their lives as a maid, but she left as family. And for the first time since Clara's death, Richard understood. The greatest wealth a man could ever have was not his fortune, but the people who brought light back into his world. And in that warm, living house, the light had finally returned, and this time, it would never fade again.